Perfect. So here we are. Hi, I'm Juliana de Luna. I live in Ontier, but have lots of friends, as you might have noticed, in Atlantia and in other places. I have been interested in sort of old world, new world encounters for a really, really long time, and have been sort of in an off again, on again way, capturing a lot of information about people moving around. I'm actually interested in all directions. In fact, I say from time to time that my real persona is an Indiana. That is to say, a woman who was born or spent a substantial amount of her life in the Spanish colonial era, that is to say, in this case, in Mexico, or rather Mexico, and then came back to Spain. So someone who's not indigenous. But today what we're going to be talking about indigenous people who traveled to Europe, sort of different ways and different mechanisms, and give you a sense of what some of those experiences might have been like. Feel free to interrupt me and ask questions. I've got a lot more information than the specifics that I'm sharing today because, of course, you know, it's a huge topic. Feel free to ask questions in chat or to just interrupt me. I'm pretty easygoing that way. So I'm going to start then by sharing screen. And let us look at a whole bunch of pretty pictures and maps because, hey, that's the best way to do this. So let's start at the very beginning of the encounters between people in the Americas and Europeans, and that is by thinking about the Vikings. So we know that there are Viking encounters in we know that Vikings come to the New remains at a place called Lanza Meadows. We also know that there is some interaction, kind of unfriendly, between the Vikings and they call them the Skraelings. Mm-hmm. And so that's sort of the first place where we know pretty clearly that there's interaction. The nature of that interaction, what really happens is, you know, kind of we have this very vague one-sided set of stories told in the Viking sagas about this, but it's there. So let's quickly jump now to the Columbian encounter, which is the important part of this in terms of numbers of people. But before we do that, let's quickly walk through places in the Americas at the start of the Columbian encounter, just to give us a sense of the people who encounter Europeans and interact with them. So the next set of maps we're going to look at are from 1491, just because there are beautiful maps that let us take a look at all of this. So a couple of things I want you to notice. The first thing is that there are people living in agricultural communities across big chunks of the Americas. Not actually in the area I live. So I live now in modern Washington state that is up in one of those big areas. It's a little dry for good agriculture where I am. But if you look across the entire eastern half of what will become the United States, much of southern Canada in the eastern half, big chunks of the American Southwest, on into Mexico, Central America, and the vast majority of South America until we get down to that very southern coastal area of Argentina, which is like the Great Plains. It's big grasslands. And there were people living there, but mostly they were people who moved around the landscape trying to make a living from various things. In some places, there were big cities. So that's true, for example, in the Andes, where Cuzco was the center of an enormous empire, in modern Mexico, where Tenochtitlan, the capital of the Aztecs, was so big that it struggled for language to even talk about it. Let's dive in a little bit now. So the first area in which there's a really substantial encounter between Europeans and indigenous people, I'm gonna often use the term indigenous people as a translation of the Spanish indígena, which is the polite term to talk about native people in much of Latin America. And so I have a tendency to use that language, though, of course, you know, there's different language for the United States, for Canada, and other kinds of places. So you can feel free to listen and hear one of those other words if you care to. But I'm kind of Latin America focused, both in my recreation, but also in sort of scholarly kinds of things I think about. So I have a tendency to use indigenous person, just so you know. So in the Caribbean, there are big towns that are organized into chiefdoms, that is relatively small things, not things that we would think of as a state. There are sometimes multiple on an island, sometimes separate ones. They're mostly Taino and Carib, from whence, yes, the word Caribbean. On the mainland, sort of the next area that really will be involved in the colonial encounter in a big way is Mesoamerica. That is modern Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, northern, or rather western Honduras and El Salvador, and on even into Nicaragua and Costa Rica. And there, you know, the big people we're talking about. So in the main area of Mexico City, we have the Mexica Azteca, or the Triple Alliance, because it's actually 3 places that are involved in this, though Tenochtitlan is the main one. There are other Nahua speaking people sort of all across central Mexico, some of them engaged in the Aztec Empire, others independent, like the Tlaxcalans. We'll talk more about them. Tlaxcala is that little orange, so all the green there is Aztec controlled area. That little yellow spot off to the right of Mexico City is Tlaxcala. It was independent. They allied with the Spaniards on the grounds that the enemy of my enemy must be my friend, or at least my ally, and then took advantage of it all through the colonial period. There's the Tzintzuntzan kingdom. Today we call that ethnic group the Purepecha. There are Mixtec and Zapotec kingdoms. There are Maya kingdoms. Here you should be thinking about small city-states. There had been periods in which the Maya area was a little bit more unified than it was when the Spanish got there, but in 1491, there are dozens, maybe as many as 50 to 60 independent city-states, all kind of interacting both in the highlands of Guatemala and in Yucatan in the northern area. They're probably, all in all, at least 10 million people, maybe more. Just the Aztec Empire alone was the same population as Spain. Heading further south to the even bigger and crazier things. So in South America, the Andes, when the Spanish arrive, are dominated by the Inca. The Inca are actually pretty newcomers to this. If you'd come 100 years previously, you would have found a situation way more like what Mesoamerica looks like, where there are lots of independent groups and a rising empire. Here, there may be 20 million people. In other words, the Inca Empire is bigger than pretty much any state, any country in Europe at the time. In the northern area, so Colombia and northern and southern Central America, there are a whole group of, again, these little chiefdoms and city-states producing, oh my God, stunning gold. And then again, there are small chiefdoms out into Amazonia. You can see sort of a whole bunch of names there for different kinds of groups. And then in the far south, people who are nomadic, who are moving around, who are gathering wild foods across the landscape.
I have a question.
Sure, please.
I have read that before the New World people came to South America, there were about 80 million people in South America. Is that?
80 million is an extremely high estimate.
Okay.
I would say that so it's really, really hard to figure out how many people lived in the New World. And the reason it's really hard to figure out how many people lived in the Americas, just to be clear, is that European diseases are completely new to the people in the Americas, right? The diseases that we live with today, most of them develop from agriculture. That is, they come from animals and other kinds of things. And so all those diseases that were endemic in the old world didn't exist in the new world. In fact, it's possible that really the only diseases that existed in the new world were things like, so syphilis was there almost assuredly. There's some evidence for tuberculosis, and a couple of, there's just a couple of parasite-driven stuff. I might be done with the entire list. When Europeans show up, they show up with smallpox and, you know, typhus, and typhoid, and influenza, and the plague, and just dozens and dozens of diseases. And what happens is a complete collapse of the population. Now, in Mexico, which is actually sort of my main research area, we actually have data from very, very early on. And so we actually can sort of reconstruct kind of sort of what the populations might have looked for before 1520, right? Which is, you know, so the Columbian encounter there really starts in 1519. There are some people there before that. A couple of guys who are shipwrecked in the Maya area around 1517. Columbus wanders up and down the coast in 1504 and 1510. But in Peru, the problem is that the disease gets there before the Spanish do. And the first censuses we have are like 20 years after the conquest. And so by the time we have the earliest censuses in Peru, we're like 40 years into collapse. So how many people were living there? I don't know. I tend to be one of those people who thinks that the number for the entire set of the Americas was about 100 million. That leaves me with a number of maybe 40 million in South America, of whom maybe 20 were part of the Inca Empire. But it could be way higher. We just don't know, right? I mean, pick your number. There, it's a matter where people complain about this. Somebody asked why there are fewer zoonotic diseases in the Americas, because there are fewer domestic animals in the Americas, right? Basically, the entire set of domestic animals in Mexico is the dog, the turkey, and Muscovy ducks. The mere fact that I get to Muscovy duck should tell you something. In the Andes, it's llamas and their relatives, right? But really only llamas, vicuñas and I cannot think of the other one. Anyway, the other one. And then guinea pigs. And so there just aren't as many animals to have zoonotic diseases from. Yeah, Guns, Germs, and Steel is a really problematic book in some ways, but does a really nice job of laying out that part of the story. So the answer is, if you think that there were 80 million people, you've got to pick a number bigger than 20 for the Inca Empire. But the honest truth is no one knows, because the records are just too problematic. Oh, and by the way, I should note, the early records even the early Spanish records, they're not complete censuses. They only tell us how many households there are. So even there, we're kind of guessing, right? So these are really good questions. And like I said, it just remains unknowable. Therein lies the thing. So North America, I really want us to focus on just a couple of places where there's a real encounter. So the Southwest, where we're talking about the modern Puebloan peoples. In fact, some of the Pueblos like Acoma existed when the Spanish first arrived in this area shortly before 1600 and are still there today with the same indigenous people living in them as we're living there. In sort of the central Southeast, there were these Mississippian chiefdoms. These ones will be completely devastated by disease. And by the time the English settlers who will settle along the coast come over the Appalachian Mountains into that area, the area will have been completely reworked in an ethnic sense. I spoke with someone who was Cherokee, and they described their situation as we were talking about it as, you know, these are the refugees from, you know, essentially a civilization destroyed by disease. There are Algonquian people sort of all along the northern part of the coast, and these are the folks who are going to be the core of the early parts of the encounter with the English. To the inland, there's the Iroquois Confederacy, lots of foraging nomads in places. And basically, by the 18th century, there are enormous changes in this area, right? Because as Europeans get more involved, people begin to get more involved with what Europeans are doing who are already here. And of course, disease will have this immense effect. So all of these things change a whole lot. So just take this as the 1491 moment. So let's point out a few pieces. So I am telling these key moments from a European perspective because I just want you to focus on timelines, and to try to tell these from indigenous perspectives. I'd have to talk about lots of indigenous perspectives, and it would be endless slides in an entire class, which at some point I might actually do. So 1492 is Columbus's first voyage. The first indigenous people to be brought to Europe in this era will be brought back at the end of that first voyage. The first permanent Spanish settlement is established in the Dominican Republic, or what will become the Dominican Republic. I'll mostly call it the island of Hispaniola, in 1496. And of course, the local Taino population begins a sharp decline due to disease and mistreatment. By 1500, a slave trade begins both ways, both bringing indigenous people to Spain and then later to Portugal, and also the beginning of bringing people from West Africa to the Caribbean to replace the dying off people who are the indigenous people who are dying off here. So that whole exchange will start. As I said, on the mainland, there are some encounters before 1519, but the big encounter starts in 1519 when Hernan Cortez lands in modern Veracruz, burns his ships, and begins to march inland. It will be 2 years in 1521 before Tenochtitlan falls to them together with their Tlaxcalan allies, but they'll be there the whole time. The following year, the Spaniards will conquer Tzintzuntzan, that western Mexican state. From 1524 to 1526, the Spanish will move their attention south and integrate the Maya city-states, first in the highlands, then in the lowlands of Yucatan into the Spanish Empire. In the 1530s, they'll conquer the Inca Empire. By 1535, the first Portuguese towns will be established in northeastern Brazil. And here's an interesting date for us. In 1542, in Spain, the so-called new laws forbid the enslavement of indigenous people. Now, note what that means is that from 1492 to 1542, indigenous people are being taken to Spain and sold into slavery. That will start a little bit later in Portugal, probably, certainly by 1500 or thereabouts. It's really complicated in Portugal because the term Indian, is used both to talk about people from India, and also from people from the Americas, right? So it's sometimes really complicated to figure out when they're talking about slaves, whether those slaves are Caribbean or Brazilian people or whether they're from Goa, right? So after 1542, then enslavement in Spain of indigenous people is forbidden. Later, much later, almost to the end of our period, Spain and Portugal will become briefly unified, and those will become the law of the land in Portugal too. Now, one of the things this does is it creates a moment in which we see lots of lawsuits around enslaved indigenous people seeking their freedom, right? So it's one of the sources of information we have about the number of people from the Americas living in Spain in particular. So North America, right? Around 1,000, there are small Viking settlements. In the 1490s, there's exploration of the Atlantic coast and the St. Lawrence Seaway, so just after Columbus. And European sailors are starting to use this area. And with it, in sort of shortly after 1500, we'll start seeing the first clear records of the bringing back of people from this area to Europe as well. From the 1520s to 1600s, Spanish explorers will travel through essentially most of the southern half of the modern United States. Their explorations and entradas in the west and in the east. From the 1540s to 1599, there are attempts to establish French Canadian towns in the St. Lawrence Seaway. Most of them fail. It's right around 1600 that the first permanent settlements will be set up. In 1565, St. Augustine in Florida is set up, and a really solid encounter between the people of Florida and the Spaniards in this area will begin. There are a whole group of failed attempts to establish East Coast European settlements, the most famous of which is, of course, Roanoke in the 1580s. So in 1607, Jamestown will be established as the first permanent settlement from the English or French in North America, and in Santa Fe in New Mexico will be established. So that gives us a sort of sense of places where encounters are likely to happen. So by 1590, remember in 1590, there are no permanent settlements in the New World by anybody except the Spanish and Portuguese, but this is kind of what the Spanish and Portuguese world looks like in 1590, and you can get a sense of what kinds of New World places are having intensive encounters with Europeans. Remembering that in all these places that we're looking at, except maybe some of the Caribbean islands, because by 1590, there aren't many indigenous people left, the vast majority of the populations in these places is indigenous. That is less true in the Portuguese world, because in the Portuguese world, lots of indigenous people just flee to the interior. But if you went to Mexico, even the city of Mexico, because remember the city of Mexico is the Aztec capital, or even to Lima. Lima's weird because Lima was a new city. Cusco was the Inca capital. You would discover a city full of indigenous people, in which you would hear Nahua in Mexico or Quechua and Aymara in Peru just as much as you would hear Spanish. That'll change, of course, because the people who live there slowly become culturally Spanish. But even today, the vast majority of Mexico City and the vast majority of Cusco are people who are pretty direct indigenous descent, but they don't identify as indigenous particularly. So let's try to put some numbers to things. So scholars estimate that before 1600, that literally thousands, maybe tens of thousands of people were brought or came from the New World to Spain and Portugal. Some to visit, some to stay, and some brought as slaves. So some came voluntarily, some came involuntarily, right? hundreds from the New World to France, and tens from the New World to England. Most of those people from Latin America, modern Mexico, especially, and Brazil, to a lesser extent from Peru and Central America, and from Guyana, which was an area that the English and the Spanish were already starting to fight over. Some came from the North American coast and from the St. Lawrence Seaway, and there are even some Arctic people who were, in the case of those folks, pretty exclusively involuntarily brought as captives back to England. Just to give us a little length to talk about these things, I'm not going to do this in a lot of things, but like I said, India or indigena are the names used in Spanish for the people who are living in the Americas. I'll use, like I said, indigena translates as indigenous person, and it's what I usually use. A mestizo, in early period, a mestizo is quite literally the child of a Spaniard and an Indian. In later generations, it's used to simply mean someone of mixed origin, and we're going to be talking about mestizos as well as about indigenas. So a couple of other quick words that I probably won't use, but just in case I do, we got them. A peninsular is a Spaniard from Iberia. A criollo is a person of Spanish descent born in the Americas, and an indiano is a Spaniard returning to Spain from the Americas. So like I've said, at least one of my version of my persona is an Indiana. That is to say, she's a woman who grew up in Mexico, but then came back to Spain, but of Spanish descent, but came back to Spain. And really quickly, don and doña are just titles of respect, and they're used for everybody from gentry up to the king and queen. So if you look at circa 1600 Spain, you will discover that Don Quixote, right? I mean, Don Quixote he's just some dude, right? I mean, he's gentry, he has some property, but you know, that's Don. And if you went in front of the king, you would call him Don Carlos or Don Felipe if you're a little later, right? So when we see, one of the things that we're going to be looking at then is indigenous people given this title, indigenous people who have the right to carry a sword and ride a horse and look like Spanish nobility, because some of them functionally are. So where we start then is with root one, which is kidnapping translators. I separate this out from forms of slavery because the whole point of these translators is that while they are kidnapped, they literally are grabbed, taken on ships and hauled off back to Europe someplace so they can learn Spanish. In these cases, we'll do some that are English in just a second. But they're not perceived to be slaves because after they start doing what you want, they start getting treated just like anybody else. So this actually starts in 1492 with kidnapping of a group of people. The most important one and the one we're going to care most about is a guy who is baptized as Diego Colon. Colon, for anyone who doesn't know, is just the Spanish language form of Christopher Columbus's surname. So in other words, this guy is baptized using the exact same name as the literal biological son of the conqueror Christopher Columbus. His son is Diego Colon, and so is this guy. The reason we care about this guy is he actually survived, so we actually know a lot about him. A lot of the people that they kidnapped, of course, die because they're being exposed to all these diseases. While he wasn't originally kidnapped as a translator, Squanto, that is Tisquantum, right? He's just post-period, but his story is kind of similar, right? He's kidnapped, he's taken as a slave. He spends some time in Spain, he spends some time in England, and then he goes back to New England to his people. And he happens to be there just at the time that the Pilgrims arrive. So the Pilgrims arrive, and there's this dude who speaks English and understands England culturally because he has spent a couple of years of his life living in England. He probably spoke Spanish too, by the way. So people were kidnapped and brought to Europe from the Caribbean, from Brazil, and from the North American coast and the St. Lawrence Seaway. By the time we get to the situation in Mexico, it looks like those same kidnapped translators don't ever make it back to Spain. So this image is an image of Hernan Cortez. He's the guy on the right. On the left, we have the rulers of Tlaxcala, that area that gets allied to the Spanish. And behind him is his translator, Doña Marina, or Malincin. We don't know if Malincin ever went to Spain. She might have in 1528, but she's not recorded as having done so, but Cortez went with a whole bunch of people. So it's possible she went, but it's also possible that she just spent her entire life in Mexico, but again, came to be, you know, a translator for the Spaniards. So Here are a couple of stories from people's lives. So Diego Colon, first guy I mentioned, right? He's kidnapped and brought from Hispaniola back to Spain. He's presented at court. He's baptized. He looks like he lives with Columbus. The next year, he goes back to the Caribbean with Columbus. It looks like he stays in Hispaniola for a decade, but on the next voyage, he goes back to Spain. This time it looks like voluntarily, stays there for 5 years, goes back to Hispaniola in 1508. In 1514, he's alive in Hispaniola and on the Spanish pay. That is the Spaniard, there are records of him being paid by the Spaniards in 1514. So a North American version of this same story, a guy named Monteo. So Monteo lived in the modern Roanoke area. And as they were trying to set up the colony around Roanoke, they went and they kidnapped some people and they brought them back to England. So from 1584 until 1585, so for about 8 months, he lives in England along with a couple of other people, literally in the house of Sir Walter Raleigh. So again, you know, these aren't people who are living in, these are people who are being involved in some kind of society kind of experience. So goes back. When the first attempt at a colony fails, he goes back again in 1586 and then goes back in 1587 and stays with the Roanoke colony. We don't actually know what happened to him because, like the rest of the people in the Roanoke colony, he disappears. So we don't actually know what happens to him, but that's his story. Yeah, I'm getting to them. Just give me a few minutes. All right, so the next thing that happens, and the next group of people are people who come for reasons that I call spectacle. Some of these people, again, come voluntarily. Some of these people come involuntarily. So the first big group of people, there are small groups of people who Cortez sends back to Spain before this, but in 1528, Cortez makes this big visit back to Spain, and he brings at least 70 people from central Mexico with him. They include entertainers. So there are multiple images, right, in this German costume book. There are multiple images of Aztec performers. This is a log juggler, right, who juggles logs with his feet. He also brings with him nobles, at least 3 sons of Moctezuma, at least 4 different nobles from Tlaxcala, his allies, some people from Zempoala. I mean, there's this long list of people he brings with him, plus a whole bunch of people that we don't even know who are. In 1550, there is a festival for Henri II and his wife in Rouen. They recreate Brazilian towns. There are at least 50 Brazilians plus a whole bunch of European sailors who've been to Brazil. And again, we don't know how those folks got there exactly, but the fact is that they are sort of willingly taking part in this big sort of celebration and fiesta, by the way, with a huge mock battle, actually, sorry, 2 huge mock battles. So, you know, at the very least, these aren't people who, you know, you kidnapped, you threw in a ship, you brought them and you're like, okay, you do this, right? These are people who've been there long enough, or at least are here voluntarily enough to actually do it. We also see some stuff that's ickier. So Frobisher from England does 2 expeditions. In one of them, he brings back in 1577, he kidnaps an Inuit man, woman, and a baby, her baby, and brings them back to England where, you know, they live for a few months and then they die from disease. Right? So some voluntary, some involuntary. The last bit then is about, the next bit rather, is about petitioning the crown. So Spain recognizes Indian nobility kind of all around Latin America. And those nobles then push to get their rights recognized, to get gifts from the crown, to get many other things. There's an endless array of petitions written to the crown, and sometimes people visit. So in all seriousness, the image is not of a real visit. This is a metaphoric visit. This is Guayman Poma de Ayala imagining himself presenting his book to the crown. He never actually traveled outside of Peru. But Aztec nobles visited, nobles from Tlaxcala visited, Peruvian nobles visited, and well as people from other parts of Latin America. Sometimes they stayed for years. A few even stayed permanently, married Spanish nobles. Here are some examples. So let's start with the Aztecs. So in 1528, 3 sons of Moctezuma and Montezuma, right? Come with Cortez, then return to Spain. One of his children, Don Pedro, returns to Spain in 1539. We don't actually know how long he stays, but his son, Don Diego Luis, a grandson, comes to Spain and stays for 8 years, then returns to Mexico. In the 1580s, he goes back to Spain and he stays, and he lives until he dies in Spain. He marries a daughter of the Duke of Albuquerque, and his son becomes a Knight of Santiago. So these are people who are part of the courtly life. Now, Don Diego Luis, he's a mestizo, and his children are mestizos. He's because his father married a Spanish woman, because that was the prestigious thing to do. But some of these indigenous, some of these mestizo, all of these identified as being as part of the thing. And apparently, I just looked at the time. Oh no, we're on the half hour. Gosh, forget it. Tlaxcala, right? So Tlaxcala, 1528, like I said, multiple Tlaxcala nobles come with Cortez. In 1534, they return led by a guy named Diego Maxixicatzin. Another group come in 1563. We don't actually know who all of them are. In 1585, they come again, 4 Tlaxcalan leaders, along with a guy who's their translator, a mestizo named Diego Muñoz Camargo. I misspelled his name there, who says that they spoke many times to Philip II. Right? So, I mean, we have a firsthand account from Diego Muñoz Camargo about his experience. This is the Lienzo de Tlaxcala. You may have seen some images from it. This was created to present to the king. Do you notice up top? So the right-hand side is the lower part, but you notice it's got the imperial eagle and arms, and then many images of lords of Tlaxcala. And then every image is, look at this thing we did for you. We fought for you in this town, and we fought for you in that town, and we fought for you in the other town. And what they're trying to do is do 2 things. The first thing they're trying to do is they're trying to get the king to continue to protect their communities, because the Tlaxcalans had all kinds of special rights and privileges that not all indigenous communities had. And they were successful time and time again. The king of Spain, first Carlos, then Philip II, and even Philip III, after the end of period, recognized the important service that the Tlaxcalans had done to the Spanish, and they kept giving them special privileges and special rights. And so as it turns out, we have lots of information about the experience of Tlaxcala, because they were self-governing, and their town council, their cabildo, kept records, by the way, in Nahua, the indigenous language spoken there, up until well after 1600. Pretty cool. All right, so a few more examples. So here we are from Peru. In 1543, a translator traveled with the conquistador Alonso de Alvarado to Spain in the Spanish court. In 1563, a Huanca leader, the Huanca are another indigenous group. So this isn't important Inca people, the important Inca people on the right-hand side, came to the Spanish court in 1563. So then 2 grandsons of Atahualpa came to Spain. One of them, Don Sebastian Poma y Laquita, was there in 1566 and stayed till 1574. Don Alonso Atahualpa was there in 1587. He had to get an extension to his 3-year permission to be there. So presumably he'd already been there for 3 years. He died there a few years later. So, you know, these are people who are coming and staying and are important people at court. Another Inca, he's a cousin to these first 2. He's a grandson of Payu, who was actually the last Inca. Atahualpa was murdered by the Spanish, and one of his brothers replaced him. So Don Melchor Carlos Inca was the last person who was really recognized by Peruvian indigenous people as being sort of a legitimate Inca, like the real ruler of all the Incas. He was actually a mestizo, but he moved permanently to Spain in 1600 and died there 10 years later. Last, and the largest number of people we would have is people who were there as slaves or in personal service to masters. It's really hard to distinguish these 2 things for 2 reasons. The first thing is that a lot of people arrive in Spain with a very unclear status. It is, they don't necessarily think of themselves as slaves, but their masters think of them as slaves, and sometimes kind of vice versa. Slavery, like I said, becomes illegal in 1545, but it's still kind of going on. We have lots of information about lawsuits, but it's also true that many of the people have moved, they're in Spain. They really want to stay in Spain and not go home, because in some cases they don't have any relationship with home. And so sometimes they stay as servants to their former masters even once they become free. And as I said, there are thousands and maybe tens of thousands of people who fit into these categories living in towns and cities all around Spain and Portugal. So we have clear records of slaves in Europe from the Caribbean, from Mexico and Central America, from Brazil, from Peru. There are North American slaves, but they're taken in very small numbers, and people are really secretive about them because it's kind of not legal, but it's done. As I said, in Spain and in Portugal after 1580, which is when the Spanish rules become rules in Portugal, they often remain as free people. We see marriage and death records. We also see the Crown of Spain sometimes gives them money to return home if they want to, because they are considered citizens of and protected. The indigenous people of Latin America are in important ways protected by the Crown. They're considered kind of like children. They're not considered legally to be regular old adult citizens. But one of the results of that is that the Crown can be asked to give them money to go home. World. And so we see these kinds of lawsuits and these requests for money that let us see these indigenous people in much more visible kinds of ways than some other kinds of slaves. So here's what we've got attested in period, right? These are the things that right now I can tell you for sure happened. People from the Arctic and subarctic North America were brought back to England. There are 2 different cases. That's all I got. People from the Northern Atlantic Sea coast. Here we're talking about Canada and on down through the St. Lawrence Seaway and New England. We see examples of people in England and Spain, in Portugal, and in France. Folks from the southern part of the Atlantic seaboard. Here we're talking the mid-Atlantic down to Florida. We see them in England and France and Spain. I wouldn't be shocked to see somebody in Portugal, but I haven't seen it. Folks from the Caribbean seem to end up in Spain and Portugal, remembering that folks from the Caribbean largely are wiped out pretty early, right? So there aren't large numbers of people in the Caribbean by the time the French and the English are really getting into the big explorations. There aren't that many indigenous people left in the Caribbean. From Latin America, from Mexico, we see people in Spain and Portugal and even Italy. It wouldn't shock me to see somebody in England or France, but I haven't seen it. Folks from Central America here, places like Panama and Spain. Folks from Brazil end up everywhere. There are people from Brazil in England and France, especially, of course, in Portugal, but also in Spain. Guyana from France, in Spain and England. Walter Raleigh also, in addition to his work in Roanoke, he's also working on getting a settlement going in Guyana. And so he brings people from Guyana to his house as well. And folks from Peru and Colombia and Spain. Nothing would surprise me, but that's all like I can trivially prove to you that there were people who were traveling in these kinds of ways from these places back. So let's look at some pictures because, hey, pictures, right? So these are pictures from early colonial Mexico. So women, I've yet to find pictures of indigenous women wearing European clothing. I'm sure that some did. So for example, 2 daughters of Moctezuma, Leonor and Isabel, both married Spanish noblemen. In all seriousness, Isabel married first indigenous men, and then after that she was married like 5 times, maybe 6. She had bad luck. Men died, right? This guy, Fernando de Alvarado Tesosomoc, he's a mestizo. And you can see here wearing Spanish clothing, though his haircut is a very typically indigenous haircut. It's one of the things that will tell you that someone's culturally indigenous is they've got the little bangs and bowl cut. You'll see this over and over and over. So this is Marina, Doña Marina Malincin there on the right, on my left. And then a whole group of Tlaxcalan women. And you can see the kinds of dresses and capes that they're wearing. Let's take a look. Some more images from, so this is an image created in colonial Tlaxcala, and you can see some of the men. So the guy who's sitting here, he's Spanish. The monk, he's also Spanish. All right, actually, all those people up top are Spanish now that I look at it. But down at the bottom, we see people who are wearing a different mix of different clothing, right? Some of them are wearing sort of Spanish clothing, but with the capes that are very typical of Nahua noblemen. And others are wearing straightforward sort of traditional clothing, which would be something like a loincloth and then one of these capes. I couldn't find any great images from Yucatan. I wanted to, but hey, it's the Shu family tree. So, we can see here a woman and a man in a sort of sense of what in an early colonial period somebody might have been wearing. I will, by the way, make sure this is shared so people can look at it. So North American images, we'll look at one more in just a second. So of course, there are a group of very famous images of Pocahontas with her various names. These are images then of those Inuit people who I mentioned being brought back, and you can see so the guy and then the woman, and do you see the little baby who's in her hood? Yeah. Unfortunately, none of them do very well. They all end up dying within a few weeks to a few months after they arrive in England. Of course, so does poor Rebecca, right? Pocahontas also does not survive the trip. But really quickly, even though this is well after 1600, in addition to her, she comes with other important men and women from her tribe, who are also, one of them is one of the most important people is actually her brother-in-law. But she also comes with other women and other men. Some of them, she's the only one who doesn't make it, unfortunately. Everybody else seems to survive. Some of them stay in England and die there months or years later. Others return back to Virginia. Right? So again, it's not just her, but a whole group of people, at least a dozen. And one last picture from before 1600. This is just described as a Virginia youth. So you can get a sense of, again, what someone who wore sort of the less Europeanized kind of clothing. Really quick note, one of the things that's described very clearly is that her brother-in-law, when he comes, he does not wear European clothing. Everyone comments on it, on the fact that she's dressed like a good English noblewoman and he's not dressed like an English nobleman, and people really comment on it. So a real mix. So let's look at some Peruvian pictures. So these first two pictures are from the book that Felipe Wellman Poma de Ayala wrote, it's called The Book of Good Government. But what it really is a great description of Peruvian life and a description of what's going on. So Poma de Ayala, again, is a mestizo. He is the son of a Spanish conquistador and an Inca princess, basically. She's the daughter, I think the granddaughter, actually, of one of the Incas. So he creates images. So this is him. Notice he's wearing sort of European clothes, but he's surrounded here. He pictures himself surrounded here by his ancestors who aren't. And you'll note again the haircuts. So on the right, we have images of indigenous elites and a Spaniard. So you've got one guy who's wearing very, very European clothes. Somebody who's wearing much more Inca kind of clothes, but notice the haircut, right? It's like this indigenous haircut. I think it was enforced by the Spanish because you see it pretty much everywhere, right? They got bangs and they got this bowl cut, and the Spaniard has a very different haircut. You can like pick out indigenous people in these images because they're wearing their hair in really different ways than the Spanish do. So two more images. This is an image of Don Melchor. He's that last legitimate Inca, picturing him. And this is Beatriz Claracoya, who is an indigenous woman. Again, she is the granddaughter of an Inca. And as you can see, she marries a Spanish nobleman. She actually never goes to Europe, but it's a great picture. The pictures of women are much harder to find. So you can see a woman who's wearing this clothing that's it's like kind of Spanish and kind of Inca. It's between. This is not what a normal Inca woman would have worn. It's decidedly Spanishized, but at the same time, it sort of holds on to a whole group of Inca sort of traditional kinds of images. Her daughter, after the end of period, does in fact go to Spain and spends considerable period of time there. A couple more South American images. So this is a late period image of a Peruvian noble. Again, these folks are wearing what would be very much traditional indigenous clothing. And then just to finish this off, a European image of an important leader in Guyana talking to Sir Walter Raleigh. That's Sir Walter Raleigh on the right, and the indigenous leader. So you can get a set of images to sort of get a sense of how people present themselves and how people are presented. And before I open this up for questions and discussions, because I love this picture way too much, I have to show you this. So one more thing, and that is that there are also in various parts of Latin America, communities created by escaped slaves often mixed with indigenous people. And some of the leaders of these communities are recognized by the state. This is particularly true in modern Ecuador. So this is Don Francisco Arobe. He's the guy in the middle, and his two sons. Notice they are also both described as Don, as noblemen. Look at the clothes they're wearing. They're wearing like European clothes with these capes that again are tied to indigenous leadership. Crazy jewelry that's very typical of the area between, so the Inca never would have worn jewelry like this, but in today we call it the intermediate zone. It's from sort of the northern Andes up to the southern part of Mesoamerica. These people were gold crazy. They made gold into everything, and there's endless gold jewelry, and you can see these guys, earrings, nose rings, the whole bit, and these crazy ruffs. Isn't that amazing? So his sons for sure are mixed Black and indigenous. He may have been as well. We don't know very much about him, but we know he married an indigenous woman who is the mother of his sons. And he led a community of Black and indigenous people today in modern Ecuador. And they were tributaries of the crown, but they were also self-governing. There were similar communities in Mexico and Hispaniola. I don't have good pictures of them. I just have to include this because, it breaks so much of our images, right, of what's going on. Again, we don't know that these people went back to the old world, but I just have to remind us that our images of things are way more complicated, the reality is way more complicated than our images of all these things. So with that, I want to open it up and answer questions that people have. I have lots more stories, by the way. So if no one has any questions,
did you come across the Florentine Codex when you're doing your research?
Sure, but the Florentine Codex was all produced in Mexico, so it's not part of this story.
Okay, and the only thing I was mentioning related to this is that the friar that wrote it and compiled it came from Spain to New Mexico with a group of Nahuatl natives who were teaching him Nahuatl while they were on the ship going back.
Okay, I've never heard that he actually learned Nahuatl before he got to Spain, New Spain, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's what I read, and
right.
Obviously there's a lot of this stuff.
Trying to think when did Sahagún come to New Spain? I don't remember.
I think it was in the 1520s, but he spent the rest of his life there. It was like 40 years.
Right, exactly. So one of the really cool things that he did was he sent, so basically what he did was he was teaching young Aztec noblemen, because they still thought about it that way when he was there, young Aztec noblemen. And one of the things he did was he basically sent them off to interview their parents and grandparents, right, and find out the way things used to be. Yeah, I mean, the Florentine Codex is an absolutely critical source in all of this, right? Like I said, it just isn't, it isn't, because of what I'm talking about, I didn't want to talk about the Florentine Codex. And of course, it doesn't have nearly as good pictures as, you end up using Poma de Ayala's pictures because they're like the best, well, I mean, they're the best pictures from Peru, right? Whereas there are so many other images of people from New Spain that I don't find myself using anything from the Florentine Codex there. But yeah, no, absolutely. The Florentine Codex is absolutely critical in all of this. And, he's, just a critical figure in our understanding of, history and the culture of, the Aztecs.
Right.
Because, one of the things that's sort of missing, it's interesting because the Spanish monks were so good at writing Aztec history, we don't have nearly as much. I mean, we have the Codex Chimalhuapan, but we don't spend as much attention on the Aztec versions of that history as we do. For example, when we go over to Tlaxcala, we're really dependent on that guy I mentioned, Diego Muñoz de Camargo. We're really dependent on his history, even though it's actually not as good a history as some others, because it's the only one we've got that's sort of Tlaxcalan centered, right? And the same thing is true, in the Maya area, we just don't have, anything that survives, right? That's anything like 16th century, right? Things like the Popol Vuh, while the Popol Vuh is clearly revamped from earlier stuff, the written down version we have of the Popol Vuh is 18th century. Same thing is true, so we have these, we have the Chalambalames from the books of the Jaguar from the various towns in Yucatan, but they're very, very hard to make sense of because they're not intended to be used like we use history. So again, there we're very dependent on the work of Landa, Diego de Landa. I was like, for just a second, I blanked completely on his name, right? Who wrote another sort of Relación de las Cosas de Yucatán, just like a Relación de las Cosas. Because so for anyone who doesn't know, we call it the Florentine Codex because the master version of what we use was preserved in a library in Florence. Its actual name is the Relación de las Cosas de Nueva España, the relation of the things of New Spain. So, you know.
I need to interrupt. I just say we have 8 minutes left in the class.
So
I have question. Oh, you go first.
Whichever.
I have a question. The descendants of these people who went back and forth, are there people in Spain who traced back to these indigenous people? Do we know?
Absolutely.
Have we done any DNA on all this?
So I don't know of any DNA stuff, but so absolutely, if you go look, you will discover that that guy who I mentioned, Don Luis, his second name I can't remember. He marries, remember, a daughter of the Dukes of Albuquerque. And if you go look in the Spanish nobility, you will discover that there are peers of Spain, right? Like really high-ranking nobles who somewhere out in that long list of surnames, because you know the Spanish Spanish nobles accumulate surnames. You will discover that there are a large number of people who bear the surname still to this day, de Moctezuma. It's out in their surname. So yeah, in Spain there are some people, but you know the honest truth is that most indigenous people get baptized, and when they get baptized, they take on surnames that are the surnames of their sponsor. By the way, for nobles, this becomes like a strategic thing, right? Look, if you're Diego Colon, right, you're like hot stuff, right? Because you are tied to Christopher Columbus. By the way, one of his godparents was Isabel la Católica, right? Just to be clear, one of his godparents was in fact the Queen of Spain, right? So people hang on to these names that tie them to important Spanish people, and so you can't tell from things like surnames, except for folks who are either tied to Montezuma or to the Inca nobility, because then, the Inca royalty, because they use words like Inca and Coya and other words but those disappear pretty quickly. So we don't have DNA stuff around it, but it's really interesting. So, but definitely there are people there today who are descendants of them. So the question about folks in the Philippines, the answer is I have done a little bit of work on people from Asia, both in Europe and in Mexico, and actually in Peru too, though that's really post-period. I would love to chat more about that. So we know there's a substantial group of people in a substantial group of Filipinos in West Mexico before 1600, and a weird group of Japanese folks who mostly seem to end up in Puebla. So they're coming through the Philippines. So really quick, trade routes for the people who don't know. So there's 2 ways to get sort of around the world. So the Portuguese kind of own the route that goes around Africa, right? And so people who are coming and going from Portugal come from Japan and China and India around Africa into Portugal on the Manila fleet. So the fleet goes so the Philippines are a Spanish domain, and that's where sort of all the Asia stuff comes. You go from there to Acapulco in the West Mexican coast. In Acapulco, you move stuff by land from Acapulco to Veracruz. And then from Veracruz, you go on to Spain. Early on, by the way, you did the same thing through Panama, but after like the 3rd or 4th time Panama got burned out by the English pirates, they said, yeah, to heck with that, we're not going to do that anymore. And they moved it to Mexico, where there were a lot more people and a lot more protection. And so people ended up going from Manila, whether they were Filipino or Chinese, because there's a really substantial Chinese Philippine population even in 1500, or from Japan. And then as they transited, some people would intend to go to Spain and stay, or they would stop on the way. And so that happened. There was a big group of Japanese folks right around 1600 who intended to go to Spain, and like half of them got to Mexico and were like, peace out, we're done. And they stayed in Mexico because they didn't want to get on a ship again, I think is what was really going on. And like half of them went on to Spain, and they had a really successful trip, and they went to the Spanish court, and they went to the Pope, and then they came home. and a whole bunch of them stayed in Mexico, and as far as we know, stayed in Mexico. All right. So somebody asked, purported art showing the Spanish doing some pretty terrible stuff to the locals. So the big stuff of that comes from, so there's a book called The Destruction of the Indies that's written by Bartolomé de las Casas in the 1530s, 40s, I think 1540s, that is actually really directly tied to the new laws, right? It's all about trying to make sure that indigenous people are not enslaved and treated badly and all this other stuff. When that book was translated in Northern Europe, now we're into the great religious wars. And so in the Netherlands in particular, the Netherlands had been part of Burgundy and continued to be Spanish possessions, and they were very, very unhappy about it. And so there's a whole lot of, it's called the Black Legend, a whole lot of stuff to sort of make people look really bad. And so all of those drawings, none of those drawings have anything to do with the New World directly. They're created in Northern Europe, but based on descriptions. Let me be clear, the Spanish in the Caribbean were truly, truly awful. I mean, they committed things that even by the standards of the day were war crimes, right? I mean, they talk about chopping people's hands off and, you know, burning people on you know, grills and all kinds of crazy stuff. But let me say really quickly, I have seen, for example, when I teach Latin American history, so it's the beginning of my, so mundanely, I'm an anthropologist and I teach Latin American cultures as one of the classes I teach. And so I start with a really short history thing. And one of the last images I use, it's the only image I can find from Argentina. It's an image from Buenos Aires. And it's like, here's the town. And then in the background, there's a little gibbet. They've hanged like 4 people and they're all indigenous. And so the only image I can find of Buenos Aires has like them, and let's be clear, this is a Spanish image of Buenos Aires and they're hanging indigenous people off in the background. So, you know, so the answer is this stuff real? Yes. Are the drawings real? Absolutely not. You just have to be really, really cautious about them because they were sort of like the inventions of people who are everywhere. So, so people from Brazil ended up everywhere. So there are multiple reasons for that. The first reason is that Brazil is an area, first, it's really big. But second, it's not really brought under strong Portuguese control very early, at least in most places. So there are a group of towns and that's about it. This is really different from what happens in the Spanish New World, which when the Spanish, when they conquer a place, they kind of hang on to all of it. Part of that is because they're conquering organized city-states and empires and stuff. And so basically everybody controls the turf and there's not a lot of areas that aren't under somebody's control. Brazil is full of these teeny tiny towns that aren't related to one another. And that's particularly true on the coast. There are some bigger entities in the interior, but they don't encounter them until much later. And so it becomes one of those places that it's really easy for somebody to go grab some folks and keep going. It also gets weirdly romanticized so that it's one of the places that everybody's weirdly obsessed about, which is why, you know, we end up with this demo in Rouen in 1550, in the middle of France, for God's sake. We end up with this demo of, you know, that includes 50 indigenous people. That's kind of weird when you think about it, right? Our current, but it happened, right? There's no question about it. It's really well documented. And then along the Caribbean coast, when the English get involved in sort of that northern part of the Caribbean, and Brazil goes there, right? So, you know, that's kind of why Brazilian folks go everywhere. And then I suppose last but not least, slavery doesn't get outlawed there till the 1580s, right? So you can continue to slave in that area and no one cares. All right, I mean, just to be clear, the Portuguese are taking indigenous people and making them slaves. And those slaves partly get sold in other places, but also it's true that no one cares if you go slave there because they're slaving there, right? I mean, it's not, you know, unlike if you went and sent a slaving expedition in the New Spain, right? The Spanish would consider that an act of war against Spanish citizens, even though indigenous people are like these weird, like children, but they're still ours and they're our taxpayers. And if you take our taxpayers, I'll be mad at you. Whereas in Brazil, they're not really integrated into a state in a way that the state feels like they ought to protect them. So that's kind of my answer.
Right, Juliana.
All
I
right.
need to interrupt for a second.
Sure.
It's
Yeah.
2:30, so technically the class is over. You guys are anybody is more than welcome to stay and continue talking because this room is not used for anything else for the rest of the afternoon. So if you want to stay, hang out, and that's fine. But it just said there's another class starting at 2:30 for those who want to go, and if you want to stay, you can.
So let me quickly, on these book things, let me quickly give you all my email address. It's julias@alumni.pitt.edu. Please follow up with me and I will give you recommendations, because for those, I need to think a little bit. That's not a no. It's just you need to think a little bit. I mean, so here's my deal with Guns, Germs, and Steel. And you're very welcome. This was fun. Here's my deal with Guns, Germs, and Steel. It's not an awful book for your first book, but it's an awful book if it's your 10th book, right? I sometimes have taught it to first year students.